I am pleased to introduce Professor Felicity Scott, who's Associate Professor here at Columbia GSAPP. She is also the co-director of the CCCP program, and she will introduce our second panel of the morning and our guests.
Thank you, Irene. An excellent job managing the crowds here. So welcome to the first of two curatorial dispatches, panels today on the phenomena of architecture biennials and triennials. And for Mark Wasiuta and myself, this is actually something like the third installment of a series here at GSAPP, trying to take stock sort of in real time of the contemporary state of these institutions and experiments in exhibition practice. And Mark, as you just saw in the previous panel, is a truly remarkable and inspiring curator and equally remarkable and generous colleague here at GSAPP. Okay, so as co-directors then of the CCCP program, in October 2014, we hosted a panel on the 2014 Venice Biennale, interrogating OMA's stated claim of shifting the institution's focus to architectural research, a shift in turn from the contemporary to what they claimed as a longer historical arc, that of a century, and, or so it was also argued, from architects to architecture. So additionally staged as attempts to complicate master narratives about globalization as a type of homogenizing force, that Biennale sought strategies through which, as Kohlhauer put it, and I quote him here, to explore and illuminate architecture's current impasse. And this question of globalization and how, of course, it touches down here in America as a force not only of economic inequity and environmental crisis, but of exacerbated racism, xenophobia, and hate has, of course, just taken an all too tragic and visible turn with the US election. So then last spring, we hosted a panel with Sarah Herder, representing a curatorial duo of herself and Joseph Grima, and speaking on the state of the art of architecture, the inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennial, also actually the first such event in the US, and along with Sarah was Marina Otero, representing the After Belonging Agency for a project that at that point was still very much in formation. So in that context, then, there was a lot of discussion about the proliferation and to some degree the sort of normalization, but also the value of these complicated large-scale exhibitions as a phenomena, what they might say about architecture. Certainly we spoke about their relation to host cities, the types of spaces they open up, not only for presenting work, as Reinhold put it, but for launching and testing new trajectories of research, new formats, new polemics, and political and conceptual claims for the profession, but also, just to underscore, for the discipline and also for the discourse of architecture. So we spoke in part about what one can do in and with an exhibition that cannot always be done, strictly speaking, with buildings, what potential was harbored in these formats or operating platforms, and how they may or may not relate to the proliferation of architectural museums, the earlier proliferation that came up in the morning's panel, of museums and departments of architecture within art museums that so characterized the 1980s and 1990s. So today, we're very pleased to be returning actually both to Venice and to Oslo. And firstly, we'll be hearing about the architectural imagination, curated by Cynthia Davidson, editor of Log, and before that, Annie, of course, and Monica Ponce de Leon, now the dean at the School of Princeton, a place I, of course, remain very fond of, and their project for the US Pavilion at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, a project that opened in May and is closing on the 27th. And I should say, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the bios of the speakers, but I will direct you to the program for that information. I just did want to say, though, that the architectural imagination, interestingly, will travel next year to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, and it'll be interesting to hear, how you imagine that will be tailored or received in a new context. So secondly, we'll hear about after belonging, the objects, spaces, and territories of the ways we stay in transit, curated by the 5-member collective of the After Belonging Agency as the 2016 Oslo Architecture Triennale. This is the 6th installment, 15th of Venice, the 6th installment of this Triennale, also closing on November 27th, so still up and running. And so it's my understanding, just in that regard, that Luis and Alejandra and Ignacio, will present the project, and in turn, Marina and Carlos will join us on the panel. Hey, Marina. So each team then will have 15 to 20 minutes to present their curatorial strategies and outcomes, and then again, as in the first panel, we'll convene. And so my job really here is just as a moderator, so I want to invite Monica and Cynthia to the podium. Thank you.
Where is our PowerPoint? Oh, it's not here.
Just leave it, I think.
Well, no, I don't even know. How do we forward it? We didn't get the instructions. You need the clicker. Who stole the clicker? Look. Oh, good. This is this way. This is this way. It's
Forward and backwards.
Okay, as you can see already, a team effort is the way to go. As a team, we never prepare remarks in advance because we can't coordinate our schedules to write anything down. We use the improvisational method of yes and, which our very dedicated team led them to call us the Amy Poehler and Tina Fey of architecture in this long process of bringing the architectural imagination to Venice. Let me thank Felicity, Amal, Irene, and Mark for organizing this event. We hope to tell you about a 3-year project in 15 minutes or less, including why, how, and what next.
So the country pavilions at the Venice Biennale have had a tendency over the years of taking work off the shelf and putting it on display. And we set out actually from the beginning to do something slightly different.
The process in the United States, many of you may be familiar with, but you may not, requires you to write an in-depth proposal, a thematic, a budget, how you would fundraise it, et cetera, and submit it to the Department of State in Washington. Our application was due in early December 2014, so when Alejandro Aravena was announced as the director of the Biennale and announced his reporting from the front, our process was already in motion. There was no opportunity for us to backtrack. Many people thought because we were doing a project on Detroit that we would fall into a certain category of Alejandro's theme. In fact, Monica and I disagree about this image on the ladder, but I would say that we, in fact, were offering a new perspective not only on Detroit, but also a new perspective on what was exhibited in the US Pavilion.
I hate the image because you're looking at a woman's skirt, but that's my personal view.
No, I agree with that part.
So we set out to explore the idea that architecture derives its power from its ability to imagine different alternatives to the status quo. And we decided to commission architects rather than to use existing projects. Commission architects to speculate about different conditions of the post-industrial city, working in Detroit as a sort of the quintessential American post-industrial city.
When we were awarded the Biennale project, Monica and I assembled a team of advisors in Detroit, 11 individuals from the civic sector, from the development sector, from community groups, from cultural institutions, to meet with us and discuss what potential sites in Detroit we should consider to assign the architects. There is a real here, and this issue of what reality is something we may get into in terms of exhibitions in the panel discussion. But the group sat with us and recommended some 20 sites in Detroit, many of them way beyond the scale of what we thought an architect could undertake in the 3 months they had to produce these projects.
It's also very important for us that our advisory board helped connect us with community groups, and that all of the teams of architects that were selected actually work very closely with community groups in Detroit during the process of the design. So these 20 sites were pared down to 4, and it was actually a very difficult process. After the long list, we shortened it, we went to the sites, we discussed issues of scale, issues of actually community appropriateness, community engagement, if we dare use that word. And we chose to work outside of the core of Detroit because there is a lot happening already in Detroit's core. And instead, the advisory board really pushed us to work with sites that were in the periphery.
Once we had established the sites, or concurrent with establishing the sites, we issued a request for expressions of interest from architects in the United States. The Department of State limits it to individuals living in the United States. We received more than 250 proposals, not necessarily from individuals, but from younger architects who teamed up to give depth to their portfolios. And we chose the teams that are represented by the individuals you see here. One thing that Monica and I wanted to do very specifically when we chose this group of architects is to be not only representative of the country as a whole, so geographic location played a factor, but also cross-generational, so that the age difference between the youngest here and the oldest here is probably 2 generations.
So one of the sites that we worked on is called the Quinder Cut. Does that have a pointer, do you know?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Quinder Cut is actually an old rail line that is depressed in the ground about 40 feet. It's a rail line that has outlived its usefulness. It used to be used for transporting goods. And what is important about this site is that it actually divides a neighborhood that has been thriving in Detroit, Eastern Market, from an area that is prototypical of what is happening elsewhere, with areas, blocks of the city being eroded and the urban fabric disappearing.
We invited the architects all to Detroit. They all walked the sites, met with people who had vested interests in the site and people who lived in adjacent neighborhoods. We requested the architects first come up with programs after these neighborhood meetings before they ventured into form. We asked the architects to each make models that had 4 by 7 foot footprints, because for us, in imagining a project for Detroit, it was important to capture the public imagination. That when always in mind that this show will go back to Detroit, not just be seen in Venice, but also that what would people think about their city and its potential to evolve over the next 50 years.
We chose 4 sites because, quite honestly, there's 4 rooms in the American Pavilion. But then we decided to have 3 teams per site so that we could show alternatives and alternative positions to those sites.
Very quickly, without talking about the forms, Marshall Brown proposed a K through university education complex that included housing for families and faculty. Moss proposed what I would call infill live-work housing that bridged the DeQuinder Cut, which is running up here. And Zago Architecture proposed a new federal project, which is especially poignant to us today, It was a 5-year project to resettle 68,000 Syrian refugees in Detroit with federal buildings, some 6 federal buildings that once the processing and resettlement project was finished, these would become civic buildings for the whole city of Detroit.
One of the intentions in selecting the sites was to select sites that could be prototypical for other post-industrial cities across the world. Urban blight is, of course, one of the central topics of the post-industrial city. So the Packard plant, because of its enormity, became for us a very important case study on how to deal with urban blight.
The complex is 10 city blocks long, and this is the original Albert Kahn building where he built the first free-span concrete factory floor. These are the 3 projects that were produced. A new fulfillment center along the lines of Amazon fulfillment at the top, which was topped with a new university and corporate research center. A young group of architects in Michigan who actually went against our recommendation to not tear the Packard plant down, and just came up with a way to recycle materials. Detroit is putting a lot of demolished buildings into landfill, and they were interested in seeing how those materials might be recycled as new kinds of building materials. And then Stan Allen's field condition, he uncovered that there were 100 acres of floor plate in the Packard plant, which he introduced commercial, residential, and recreational and farm into one project.
Another challenge of the post-industrial city is that historically it gives its back to waterfronts, and many cities across the globe are struggling with how to deal with this waterfront condition now that the waterfront is not used for commercial shipping anymore. In the case of Detroit, the city has invested quite a lot in developing the eastern side of the waterfront. So the advisory board really encouraged us to work with the western side, and in particular because there is this very large post office that has outlived its usefulness and that is half empty, and that the city does not think should be demolishing because it's actually a building that is in good shape. So when you see the sea of demolition in Detroit, this is one that the city is thinking should not actually take down.
This is a building from the 1960s that blocks a major access road to the river. And the projects are quite different. Berballier inserted a number of new really drilled holes into the existing structure. This is just one as part of their overall project. I'm not showing you here what they did to the waterfront site in between the post office and the river. But they made this bar, which blocks access, much more porous. Scott Cohen also cut through the post office to add a kind of inversion of the Renaissance Center. And President Future from Houston proposed to start a series of forest plantations and to begin a carbon sink for Detroit that would then pay for timber construction projects.
And then our last site, and I'm sorry that we don't have the right image at the bottom, deals with an empty lot in the center of one of the most thriving communities in Detroit, Mexican Town, and the tension that arises when immigrant communities thrive in the context of a city that is known for people moving out of the city.
It's a difficult site. This is an abandoned public works garage that the city of Detroit no longer uses, next to an elevated rail line. The projects, Max Goggin and Merrill Elam really used their imagination and came up with no building proposal, but rather a proposal that they felt reflected the desires of the community. They made 4 separate visits to Detroit and a film about the people they met. and a series of very beautiful section and plan drawings that, with an elaborate key, is that there's a spa, there's a place to get lost, there's a tower to look at Detroit, et cetera. An office proposed to do an air filtration system on top of the existing garage, which would become a marketplace, and then additional housing to relocate another neighborhood in Detroit that's going to be dislocated by the new bridge from Canada to Detroit. And Peter Bloom proposed to build a plinth with parking underneath for a new marketplace and park area and other kinds of public facilities.
As Felicity mentioned, the exhibition is going to travel to Detroit in the spring, and we're looking forward to staging public conversations around each of these sites and around each of these projects.
There's been a lot of criticism of what we did, that what we did was not pragmatic, not practical, looked like developer architecture. I think we expected that criticism. What's important to us is that we are taking to Detroit, showing them that architecture can imagine any different number of scenarios, and to equip the population of Detroit and these neighborhoods in particular with a language that they can now talk to people who are in fact transforming Detroit right before our eyes. Thank you very much.
Hello. Well, first of all, we'd like to thank GSAPP for the invitation, and also, I guess, for the great support we've received all throughout the process from the very beginning in many different forms. So we are very happy to be here presenting the project. The complete title of the Oslo Architecture Triennale 2016 is After Belonging, a Triennale in residence, on residence, and the ways we stay in transit. And it appeals both to the curatorial strategy, that is a Triennale in residence, and to the topic also, one concerned with residence and the ways we stay in transit. Both are relevant to our approach to what a Triennale could be as a platform to advance architecture, and that's what we will be discussing today. So in defining both topic and curatorial strategy, it was important to us to consider the Triennale to follow both an introspective impetus, one that would allow architecture to consider its discourses, protocols of work, and modes of operation, as well as a synchronizing impetus, one that would allow architecture to address its present context or align with it. In order to do so, After Belonging analyzes both the ways, analyzes the ways in which architecture intervenes, both in our changing attachment to places and collectivities, where do we belong, as well as to the objects we own, share, and exchange. How do we manage our belongings? Our contention is that being at home has different definitions nowadays, both within domestic settings and in the spaces defined by national boundaries, particularly considering our current regimes of circulation of people, goods, and information in a global context. Circulation brings greater access to further territories and new commercial goods, yet not everybody and everything circulate voluntarily or in the same way. Circulation also promotes human unsettlement and growing inequalities for large groups which are kept in precarious states of transit. The Triennale, in fact, reflects on current related challenges, including what has come to be called the refugee crisis. But for us, it's been very important to not respond to this phenomenon under a paradigm of crisis precisely or with a problem-solving attitude, but rather to consider these current realities and their related architectures within a larger context of global circulatory practices or processes, from which they cannot be untangled. In fact, we are considering cases like this one, the Asylum Seeker Center in Oslo, in Torshov, but we are also looking at our very houses, which we have opened to unknown guests through global home sharing platforms, and the controversial realities that they hide behind this welcoming rhetoric of belonging anywhere. We look also at further territories in the border of Norway and Russia, for example, which is now occupied by temporary workers, scientists, and tourists that circulate in parallel routes to the flows of resources and money that structure our global geopolitical landscapes. And we are also considering facilities like this one in Dubai, the healthcare city, in which architecture brings together new aesthetics and special technologies to build new residential spaces bridging healthcare and tourism. The transformation of belonging that is evident in such diverse realities and cases has destabilized the notion of residence, as well as its relationship with spatial permanence, property, and identity. And these are notions that the discipline has somehow naturalized, but might need to be demystified. But these notions also allow addressing questions that are relevant not only for architects, but far beyond, in a period of massive mobility, but also one of increasingly more evident backlashes against globalization that are lately taking its darkest form with the rise of xenophobic populism. In order to address these questions, it was important for us not to consider the Triennale just as a 10-week event, but rather as a long-term project supporting collaborative thinking, rehearsing different research strategies, and supporting also new work protocols. To do so, we aimed to start the Triennale before the opening, organizing public discussions, transforming meetings with institutions in open colloquia, and holding seminars in different institutions, including GSAPP and the Architecture School in Oslo. We also aim to engage different actors and audiences as part of that process, and we work with local institutions, including the Architecture School, but also the Association of Norwegian Architects and local NGOs, among others, to develop different aspects of the program. We also mobilized online platforms purposefully to reach global audiences through discussion on different case studies that we advanced before the opening. Resulting from this work, After Belonging manifests in 6 main platforms, and all of them are equally important for us. Those platforms that I'm going to just introduce, and then Alejandra and Luis will go in depth into them, are on residence, an exhibition dedicated to the exploration of the transformation of belonging, in residence, and a case study program that also resulted in another exhibition, a publication that, not just a catalog, expanded to larger concerns and historical developments, a conference giving voice to diverse agents, the academy that brought students and schools into the discussion, and the embassy. The embassy is the only one that hasn't taken place yet, so I'm going to introduce it briefly before we go into the next. It's conceived and designed by Studio Jonas Stahl with the communities of Rojava in northern Syria, and it's a platform that represents the ideals of stateless democracy. It will take form of an installation of which you are seeing a working model located in the Oslo City Hall, the same space that hosts the award ceremony of the Nobel Prize. And it will take place during the closing weekend in a couple of weeks. So its goal will be to host public debate considering the role of art and architecture to rethink political representation, and hopefully you'll hear more about it when it happens. So now I'm going to pass it to Luis to start with on this.
So the On Residence exhibition is conceived as a still frame attempting to document current ways in which architecture is involved in the contemporary constructions of belonging. In On Residence, research is understood as a form of practice in its own right. The exhibition presents more than 35 pieces, the majority specially commissioned for the Triennale, in which architecture takes different forms beyond the building, ranging, for example, from arrangement of objects to the logistical infrastructures that allow those objects to move and circulate, or, for example, from territorial configurations containing societies to the digital systems organizing communities. The pieces gravitate around 5 areas, which refer to multiple scales, agents, and media involved in the sort of architectures they try to discuss. And I say that pieces gravitate because, as you've just seen in the video, the areas that I'm going to present shortly are loosely defined. The exhibition, in a way, refuses any strict categorization of these contributions, which, in a way, we felt would map an illusory coherence onto the fragmentary and fluid scenarios in which we consider that belonging is nowadays redefined. On the contrary, the exhibition presents itself as an accumulation of evidences that construct a levitating but dense space of juxtapositions, in which works, in which contributions cannot avoid to be in dialogue with each other. The 5 topics around which the contributions are constellated are, first, furnishing after belonging, which addresses the smaller scale of objects which, as we are understanding them, as modes of expression, modes of relation, but also modes of communication, entangle ideas of personal identity, like we can see, for example, in signature architectural pieces in corporate headquarters. This section inspects the status of objects within the current scenarios, characterized by a transformation of modes of production, networks of commercialization, but also scales of appreciation, mainly through the development of sharing apps, as this piece in the exhibition tried to dissect. The second area was technologies for a life in transit, which reflect upon technologically enabled forms of socialization, but also on the changing relationships between, on the one hand, data, and on the other hand, bodies, objects, and also spaces. A combination that ends up generating bounded spaces of both inclusion and exclusion. Conjunction with, actually for us, came to the fore when mapping the progressive coverage of satellites' data gathering of the Earth's surface. The third area, sheltering temporariness, explored the spans of permanence affecting the regulation of residence. It paid particular attention to those conditions in which shelter was offered as a transitory alleviation, for example, the case of evictions, but in which their long-lasting character could end up considering them the status of final solutions, including from refugee camps, but also retiree tourism. The fourth category was what we labeled as borders elsewhere, which explored the material artifacts and technologies defining the liminal spaces mediating between 2 differential conditions. A friction which was manifested both in our spaces of residence, but also in our environments, as this piece shows in mapping troubling pollution. And finally, markets and territories of the global home, an area which tried to consider new forms of familiarity in a context in which the home, which not anymore is solely defined at only an architectural scale, but is situated within the global, much larger territorial scale of financial and real estate transactions, localized violence, international legalities, and commercial and touristic networks. The third platform I'm going to present, the After Belonging conference, which actually took place during the opening weekend of the Triennale in the Oslo Opera House, attempted to bring into a same discussion all the agents involved in a transformation of belonging, which architectural or urban implications. Resorting to professional profiles that went beyond that of the architect. The aim was not only to broaden the spectrum of disciplines through which a spatial controversy can be approached, but also to incorporate opposite voices in the conversation, such as those of power holders, from corporate power to policymakers, to the ones which are affected, which are questioning, or which are contesting the first decisions. The fourth that's the third platform, the After Belonging publication, considers the space of the book not only as an exhibition catalog, or as Ignacio mentioned. So together with the physical space of the gallery, the publication is understood as a parallel site for architectural production and experimentation. And that's why it brings together 20 commissioned essays from international contributors that expand the Triennale's conversation and which are interspersed with curatorial texts, research for the pieces that configure the exhibitions, commissioned photo essays, and documentation of different projects developed during this 2-year period.
These three platforms of discussion, as Luis was describing them, were not enough for us. We proposed then a program in residence that is currently presented in an exhibition at the National Museum Architecture. A Triennale in Residence, as the title asserts, is a speculative platform around 10 case studies open for site-specific interventions. One of the main ambitions of this platform is to allow the Triennale to operate internationally and reach to larger geographies and concerns. After Belonging has been active not only in Oslo, but also in Risaralda, Copenhagen, Kirkenes, New York, and Lagos, among other cities. The contemporary redefinition of belonging is a global condition, but for us it was important to bring down these global discussions, into particular realities and forms of work. We selected for that a series of sites that are relevant for this discussion. Sites in Oslo and the Nordic region include the Asylum Seekers Reception Center in Torshov, Oslo, the border spaces, technologies, and transit areas of the Oslo airport in Gardermoen, the negotiation between the transnational workers, the natural resources extraction, and the legal border definition in Kirkenes, a transnational neighborhood on the outskirts of Stockholm, where 90% of its population has a migrant background, and lastly, an apartment in Copenhagen rented through digital sharing platforms. Global sites include a patient room in the Dubai Healthcare City, an Italian textile factory in Prato, the technological spaces linking religious communities in Lagos, a personal cubicle in a self-storage facility in Manhattan, and the houses resulting from the remittances sent to the coffee-growing region of Risaralda in Colombia. This platform allows us also to expand the Triennale in time. We launched an international competition in September 2015 and selected 5 teams that have been working in residence since then. Their interventions and partnerships will remain, hopefully, active beyond the Triennale's period. In order to present the sites for the international competition, we commissioned 10 reports that offer particular and multifaceted perspectives, bringing together different scales on each site. And perhaps the most critical goal of the program in residence, of the competition and the selection of the intervention strategies, is to question the role of the architect and explore new modes of practice. The 5 teams selected include educators, researchers, and practitioners from these different disciplines as urban planners, graphic designers, and sociologists. The results of the call, that received more than 200 proposals, show the different working protocols and formats, ranging from a legislation processes to offer private housing alternative for asylum seekers and refugees arriving to Oslo, a city guide by for asylum seekers, which proposes their interaction, integration, and participation in the cultural, social, and economic life of the city, a parliament that establishes a series of open discussions between the different agents involved in the Arctic region to consider other forms of self-governance, a digital app to rent objects and furniture by the minute, and lastly, a set of artifacts that reflects on particular passenger experiences where the airport regulations were exposed and contested. The In Residence exhibition brings together the curatorial perspective in the form of a text and an image, and the work of the reporter and the architect intervening on each site. Both the report and the intervention strategy are intended as 2 distinct and related architectural operations to approach those sites. By bringing them together, the exhibition aims to test the capacity of architectural expertise to respond to changing realities. Additionally, we propose a 5th platform, The Academy gave us the opportunity to discuss our concerns with the students as future practitioners and thinkers. Together with the Oslo Architecture School, we invited more than 10 universities and more than 120 students from around the world in a knowledge-sharing experiment. Both the in-residence program and the Academy push the concerns of the Triennale into the future by testing work protocols and academic conversations. This will hopefully offer new forms of engagement and have an impact in architectural practice and thought. This is a publication done by the students from the UTS University in Australia, led by Cristina Goberna and Urtzi Grau. They just launched it like some hours ago, so we thought it was like good to include it here. But before we finish and we start the conversation, we would like to get back to the title of the Triennale. The after in after belonging does not refer to a posterior condition. We're not describing a post-belonging period resulted from a nostalgia for what got lost. The after in after belonging refers to a search, a pursuit. We actually want to look after, to discuss, and to speculate on the new architectures of the new ways of being together, new collectivities, and new forms of belonging. Thank you very much.
New partners, Hey, thank you not only for your remarkable shows, but for a fantastic presentation of them. And I guess I wanted to begin by saying, well, we have two very different exhibition strategies on the table, that there are a number of things they share, and I just want to sort of parse these briefly. First, they share the commissioning of works by architects and related fields in an active way, or at least in some senses the commissioning, in your instance, of sort of existing research, current research into an exhibition format, again, a type of translation. And so the architectural imagination, in some sense, returns us very forcefully to a claim that experimental modes of practice, what once might have been called something like paper architecture, might continue to have attraction in the present. That so-called visionary architecture or theoretical plans, another formulation that you use, again, could have an impact, and that they could be presented through rather standardized formats. I mean, you spoke to the 5x7 scale of the model, drawings, animations, etc. Whereas After Belonging, I think, takes a somewhat different approach, both to commissioning, new trajectories of research and formats, but also of its presentation. So it's not that you don't use models and drawings, certainly you do, or your contributors do in Oslo, but I'd say something like they're far less uniform, in format, in scale, and the exhibition distributes them in a rather different way. So, so the landscape of commissioned projects looks very different in the two different sort of exhibition milieus that we have on the table here. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about these sorts of distinctions in models of commissioning and the exhibition strategy. But the other thing I thought actually I've got a couple more points about what they share in common. And I think both of the presentations spoke to that. They provide two different ways of resisting let's say, a too rapid approach to producing solutions to a problem. They both figure modes of sort of deferral and both insist on the need to open up the architectural process to a longer and more detailed type of strategy. And we could also say that the two sides of that, again, on the one hand, we might say it falls into visionary design and research, but on the other hand, they're incredible set of overlaps across both of those two terms. Yeah, again, even if the exhibitions look very different. But let's say, just to underscore this appreciation of the reflex not to provide solutions too quickly. I have a little note, not in my script here, that I was totally struck, Cynthia, by your comment that the reception wavered between claims that they were not practical and that they looked like developer architecture. Surely a sort of fantastic contradiction in terms of how we typically imagine developer architecture, you know, to be so embedded in the real economic processes as to have very little remainder. Anyway, so a second way of just thinking the projects together returns me to the sort of contemporary effects of neoliberalism and other forces of globalization that are present in both shows, and the impacts of these both on cities and on populations, from questions of deindustrialization, migration, of inequality, and the question of how architecture might interface, respond to, articulate, broadcast some of these contemporary concerns. So again, what it might look like, what tools architecture might bring to the question, whether they're research, design, visualization, come up in slightly different ways in the two projects. I also have a little remark here, just to come back to my earlier comment that many of the programs that are addressed, from immigrant centers, refugee centers, even to high-tech campuses and ecological issues, again, all have taken radically different valence since Tuesday's election. So maybe I'll start there, the two questions of these sort of strange intersections and divergences between the concerns and then, let's say, the exhibition format, so what the exhibitions look like, how they present architecture to a public audience. So.
I think that probably the most interesting overlap, hi, I'm Cynthia, we haven't met. So we're really talking across borders here. But for me, the most interesting overlap is I think that we have each created exhibitions that are expanding way beyond the walls that originally contained them. That these aren't just exhibitions, but are a kind of activism, both within the discipline and within the community. Tell me that I'm wrong. But when I see the many platforms that your colleagues just went through, I mean, Monica and I have a similar thing in play, which is why I said at the outset, this exhibition has turned into a 3-year project. I mean, it's not only going to Detroit, it's going to Los Angeles after Detroit. So, and for completely other reasons, in fact. So to create an exhibition that has an extended life, not just in traveling from institution to institution, which many exhibitions do, but that have these sort of outreach programs, whether in schools. We were very involved in the University of Michigan, obviously, with the setting up the whole, involving students and the whole setup of how the architectural imagination was formed, the discussions the architects had with the students as well as the community, but all these discussions that are happening after, and these sort of education platforms that we hope the exhibition will stimulate. Do you think we share that?
Yeah, I mean, should we go? Okay, go. Yeah, I think that actually, I mean, for us, what was interesting was that we were not operating only with the format of exhibitions. We were basically curating a triennale, and that was a project for us, right? We understood that as the main project, and that's why we actually, what we inherited from the institution was like, well, actually, previously the triennale was an exhibition, a publication, and a conference that was not even actually managed by the institution itself, right? So for us was a very important process to understand that as one of the first curatorial strategies, right? To understand what are the formats that are going to allow for the discussion to be channeled to the audiences that we wanted to reach, but also to the formats that, or to the roles of the architect, or the kind of architecture that we wanted to talk about, or to discuss, or to even interrogate, right? And that's why also we diversify the Triennale into these kind of 5 platforms that they like interrelate, that they juxtapose, and they address different audiences. For me, what what is kind of interesting, related also to the question of Felicity about the how to commission, right? How to commission for exhibitions. For us, the formats allowed us to understand the idea of commission as a malleable thing, right? Yeah, you can commission certain practices that we did, practices that have been working with the idea of belonging, identity, migration, et cetera, for the exhibition on residence, for example, to be presented. But also we opened up like a platform like the Open Call for Intervention Strategies, in which we didn't actually commission. We opened, it was an open call for people that we didn't know actually, that was able to apply and to be selected by the jury that we were part of, but it was an independent jury, right? So I think that for us also, we tried kind of like the interrogation of the format Triennale allowed us to interrogate many different elements of the process. The idea of commissioning, the idea of what is the architecture that we wanted to address, the idea of what is the role of the architect today dealing with issues so complicated as the ones that we were dealing with.
I should point in the audience here, we have Emilio Ambas, of course, somebody who commissioned some incredible project in the context of his work at the Museum of Modern Art. So the commissioning question in some cases brings us back to the new domestic landscape, to the taxi project. I mean, this is also a long and interesting history, I think, that is returning in an interesting way in more recent exhibition practices.
Yeah, go ahead. No, to also tackle on some of the other questions that you posed, but what Carlos has explained for us very important. We literally took the idea of Triennale as there is no more framework, that idea of there is a temporality involved in the project. So for us it was important to understand how the projects evolve on time and how the exhibition is not only the space in which we operate, but how these other processes will last even after the Triennale and the exhibition space closes. At the same time, I think, yeah, that's why we decided to open up the idea of also what is Oslo. So it's Architectural Triennale in Oslo, but happens elsewhere, because also was embedded in the idea of belonging, who actually creates the idea of the city of Oslo, which communities, which type of people, inhabitants, recently arrived, people is arriving from which territories. So in a way, also we are architects. So even if we wanted to open up completely the idea of what a Triennale could be, we could have decided not to do an exhibition, actually, not to operate in the space of the gallery. But actually, we did 2 exhibitions as well. So it's also tells a bit the idea about, at the end, the necessity to put on display. And I think it's an interesting question, how research could be the topic that we are discussing today, also how research manifests in the exhibition space, and how we can imagine maybe in the future if the gallery space is the space of operation. Because I think we had the chance also to say we don't do an exhibition. We just operate on site through commissions, through the academy, through the embassy. But we do have exhibition, and we did put works on display. It's also something to interrogate also, why is that still relevant?
I think at the heart of any architectural exhibition is the question of who is the audience. And for us, this was all the more pertinent because we were operating in the context of the reality of Detroit in order to set up a conversation in Detroit about public space. But our first venue is, of course, the premier architectural venue, where we know that our audience is going to be primarily architects. And that, I think, is a tension in the way that we set up the project and in the way that we thought about it. And actually, it brings into crisis the work commission. And Greg Lynn, who was one of the 12 teams that was commissioned for the project, was very critical of the work commissioning. Oh, really? Okay. And I think we failed to actually come up with a better word. And I think today, as I'm thinking through these issues, I think probably visioning would have been a better word. We were, in fact, very intentional from the beginning that we did not want practical projects. And the way that you described it is exactly the way we were thinking about it. We asked the architects to please do not attempt to, quote unquote, solve a problem of the city of Detroit. Because, in fact, Detroiters are sick and tired of people trying to solve their problems. And instead, can we envision alternatives to the morphology, the public space quality of Detroit through design projects that really exploit architecture to its limits.
So would an older form, a term like patronage? I mean, I'm just trying to think of
this is actually exactly what made Greg so nervous about the word used in commission, because commission really implies that you're paying for an architect's service. And in fact, in this case, visioning may be more appropriate because you are asking architects to imagine a different alternative to the present.
I was struck just briefly, since you mentioned bringing us back to the Venice versus Detroit, that there was actually a lot of press coming out of the local paper in Detroit, yes? And so not only was Michigan visible, but it was sort of actively engaged from afar, even before the show traveled there. And just, coming back to this question of how you, again, another thing that the projects share, and you've all spoken of it with some elegance, is this sort of dual condition of somehow addressing the global or concerns that are shared above and beyond the specificity of the site, while simultaneously paying attention to the so-called facts on the ground, in Detroit, in Oslo, but also in the sort of expanded network of sites. And so it struck me, I just sort of can't be connection, but the press, the communication apparatus also begins to connect these things. And we actually haven't talked about the issue of log. I don't know if that's somewhere you want to go, but your publication was a journal, yes? I mean, this is already not quite a catalog, but the sort of mobilization of another already, to say, well-embedded piece of media infrastructure in the architectural network. And this, speaks to a type of audience, one type of audience for the show, but I'm wondering just if we can come back to that audience question and think about how it's mediated not only in the physicality of the show, so to speak, but also the engagement with multiple publics that may not necessarily actually see. I mean, I was lucky enough to see both shows, but.
Well, I don't know if Monica and I said it because of the way we operate, but we both really believe that architecture has, as overly idealistic as it may sound, believe that architecture can create positive change. And that we selected Detroit as a site because it's a city looking to turn around its seeming destiny in another direction. There's a lot of developer activity in Detroit and a lot of community groups trying to understand what's happening and figure out what they need to do. And what is the role of architects in that? Well, in many respects for us, it's to make architecture. And so what would these people imagine that takes an architectural form? I mean, I've seen so many people go into exhibitions and there's always an audience for a drawing, there's always an audience for a video, there's always an audience for a photograph. But people really stand around models. And that's why we insisted that all of the architects make big models, because not only was it what did the architect imagine, but what would the viewer then imagine, not only in Venice, where our audience is primarily architects, so it's architects confronting another kind of what is the state of architecture today. But when it goes to Detroit, when you see a model, it's much easier to project yourself into it and imagine what that life would be. And that's a real architectural tool that architects still have that is somehow, in its physicality, has a more real quality than all these animations that we can stand and watch on a screen, at least
paradoxically so, we could say, given that it's a model. So.
In our case, I think the model is a very interesting concept in a way, because now we are assuming that is a material, a scale representation of an architectural building, but could be another architectural reality. So for us, what was important was to imagine what other type of architectural documents could be mobilized and what type of audiences could be created or constructed around those documents. So I agree with you, the idea of the model. So we thought maybe a way of intervening is through a digital platform, so immediately you have other type of collectivities gathering around that, or we have other type of architectural documents that obviously that not necessarily work well within the exhibition space, but in other spaces in which we imagine that our audiences, or at least our interlocutors, will be, because we couldn't assume that in the case of Oslo, we will have such an amazing number of visitors as Venice will happen, and at the same time we were thinking about the Triennale was happening in Oslo, but in Copenhagen, in Stockholm. So how then you imagine that political and discursive space being generated? So we needed other models, but I think, yeah, obviously.
Yeah, what is interesting, of course, is that you ask architects to do one thing, and architects do what they think is best. So for us, it's interesting to me the role, actually, the film and video played in the exhibition, despite our modest means and not really being able to afford screens. The role that other kinds of invented means of communication, we had a team that did a children's book as part of their installation.
Postcards, yeah.
So, the postcards is a slightly different. The postcards came from us, not from the participants. But so I agree. I think the model was one of the models and drawings were standards that we ask everyone to do, but we allowed everybody to do whatever media they thought was best.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it all comes to the difficulty of an exhibition that is dealing with Detroit, for example, or a difficulty of a Triennale that is dealing with such a complex situations like migration or asylum seeker processes.
Those are all issues in Detroit, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. Detroit is like, I'm completely sure, and that is why it's so difficult to really address these topics, right? So I guess that our approach to the project was a little bit more doubtful of architecture, right? It was like, okay, in all these processes, definitely architecture is involved, it's there. But we have to understand first what are the really like the agencies of architecture in all these processes, and then the capacity to really affect them, right? So that's why I think that the definition of what is the role of the architect in what we have constructed in the Triennale has many different voices, right? Many different roles. Like we have people that are studying how the arrival of migrants in Lesbos is actually connected to certain architecture, right? And in that sense, the role of the architect there is kind of analyzing and intervening, of course, with the analysis as well, but kind of like elevating what is architecture in those processes. And in the in-residence platform, we were trying to think, okay, how can we test the capacity of architecture to really inform that, modify that, intervene on that? So that's why, and I guess that comes back to what you were saying at the beginning, that we really try to interrogate the idea of a Triennale, what a Triennale is and what is the purpose of a Triennale, especially now in this year where we have like so many Triennales and Biennales, and we try to say, okay, so actually let's try to bring architects and bring teams of people that are interested in those processes to intervene on them, right? So for us, like the in-residence part...
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What for you is an intervention?
Well, that is, but maybe we have
that's a really important question.
Absolutely, and that's been like one of the central discussions that we have had in our team, right? It's like how an architect can deal with an asylum seeker center in the center of Oslo. What is the agency of architecture in those processes? So the intervention in that sense was, okay, let's open up a site, and that's actually another topic, right? The site for us was not a demarcation in a map with a very specific line, was a series of complex issues that are happening in the asylum seeker center in Oslo, right? So we open up that question to people, right? What is the intervention that you would do in an asylum seeker center? And in that sense, we had two teams that were working. One was dealing with the social issues that are happening in the center, not the building, not the brick. It was like the kind of reunions that are being produced in the center, and they were operating exactly on that sense, that is made of like how fruit is like gotten and used in the center itself. And there is another one that is dealing with the legal issues that are happening when the asylum seeker arrives to the city, right? So suddenly both interventions were dealing not with material issues, we're dealing more with like an application in a digital space, let's say, and another one was dealing with how the fruit was recognized. And the intervention in that sense was produced of a series of, during the entire year of production, a series of meetings with all the different communities, a series of meetings with the government to allow that platform to happen. And hopefully that intervention keeps on happening like now, as it's happening now with the open platform in which asylum seekers are received in the city of Oslo in private houses, right? So the intervention is actually a contemporary question of architecture. How can we intervene in the issues that are happening today, right?
I think what is important is the idea that intervention for us was a way not asking for a solution. Right. Saying, okay, we are not able also to produce a solution, not even asking for those problems within a temporality of 2 years of an exhibition and a biennial or triennial. Right. So what then, how can you, that's why you mobilize the idea of imagination, and for us was this idea of intervention. Like that not necessarily is frustrating somehow, and we also, I imagine people will be frustrated if they see the ways in which the participants intervene in the sites, but it is part of this idea of, it is an ongoing process. And
it's not a final product.
It's not a final product, and these questions might not have an ultimate solution, but still, that doesn't mean that we don't have to want to have the conversation and want to work on those issues.
Right.
No, that's where we also overlap. That we didn't propose any final product either, but rather a way to begin a series of conversations by saying, okay, here's this, here's this, here's this, now what?
Okay, so I think that's going to have to be a good place to stop. Just so please join me in thanking our panelists and also the rest of the architecture.